I want you to think about when you started a new web project. Maybe the project was for a client, or maybe it was a side project, a hackathon project, or maybe a new work project. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm usually pretty excited at the beginning of a new project. So why is that? Well, for one thing, it's a nice clean slate, and all your prior coding sins are forgiven, and it's an opportunity for you to create a solution that's hopefully better designed and engineered than previous projects you've worked on, and there's all sorts of interesting things to think about and research, and there's no technical debt to deal with yet, and there's no pending deadlines and so on. But here's the thing. As soon as I start setting up the new project, my excitement fades pretty quickly, because in my mind, project setup should take a matter of minutes, but in reality, project setups take much longer than I expect because, well, it's not something I do every day, so I always have to shake off the dust, do a bit of research to see if there are any new, quote, best practices, or any new libraries I should look at, and so on. Okay, so why am I talking about this? Well, because sometimes we make these initial setups harder than they have to be, and I want to look at one particular aspect of setting up a new project that I suspect many of us do the hard way. I know I have. So let me ask you this. How would you handle authentication in a brand new Phoenix project? Would you roll your own authentication system? Or would you primarily use a library? I bet a lot of you are probably thinking, authentication isn't that hard. I'll just code it myself. Now, writing your own authentication system isn't necessarily a bad idea, especially as a learning exercise for new programmers or programmers that are new to Elixir and Phoenix. In fact, it's an exercise I have my students do in my course, Elixir and Phoenix for Beginners, but I'm not sure it should be your first choice for a few different reasons. Let me explain. I've written my own authentication systems many times, and almost every single time I did, it ended up taking way more time than I expected it would, and I got frustrated because I just wanted to get to the interesting stuff and be done with the boilerplate code. By the way, it's never a good idea to write security-related code when you're annoyed and frustrated by it. You're just setting yourself up for bad mistakes. Have you ever heard of Hofstadter's law? It's a law that says things always take longer than you expect, even when you take into account Hofstadter's law. Yeah, Hofstadter's law haunts me, probably because I'm not the best at estimating, but that's a separate topic. Okay, so using a good library should obviously save you some time, but that's not the only reason you should consider using an authentication library. I mean, think about it. If you're writing your own auth code, you're writing security-related code. Do you want to take on all that responsibility all on your own? I mean, is your authentication code going to be thoroughly reviewed, scrutinized, tested, and audited? Maybe, but probably not. Also, do you plan on constantly staying on top of evolving security best practices? Will you constantly stay on top of new security exploits that require fixes? Okay, I don't know about you, but if I can save even a small amount of time using a library, and if I can limit the amount of security-related responsibilities I have to take on just by using a good library, well, it sure seems like a win-win. Now, I'm sure many of you have tried auth libraries that left a bad taste in your mouth, or maybe they were so bad that you just ditched it and wrote your own. I get it, that's a crappy experience, but you shouldn't let one bad experience overly influence subsequent decisions. You just need to find a good authentication library, like the library we'll be looking at in this video. So what library are we going to look at? Well, we're going to look at the Phoenix Authentication Library, PAO, and a related library, PAO Ascent. In fact, in this video, we'll create a new Phoenix project, set up authentication, add some simple route-based authorization, set up password resets, and we'll set up social logins. In other words, a login with Twitter, Facebook, or GitHub, and we'll do it all in just a matter of minutes using the excellent PAO and PAO Ascent libraries. Now, before I get started, I should set some expectations. This video targets programmers who already know Elixir and Phoenix. So if you're new to Elixir and Phoenix, you might be able to follow along, but it'll probably be a real struggle. So you might need to come back to this video after you've got a better handle on the basics of Elixir and Phoenix. Okay, let's get going. I'll start by creating a brand new Phoenix project by using the mix task phoenix.new, and I'll name our new project Task App. Next, I'll download and install the dependencies, and as soon as that's done, I'll cd into our newly created Task App directory, and I'll set up Git. Next, I'll open up my editor, Atom. Now, before I really get started, I want to point something out. Please don't feel like you need to take any notes on what I'm about to show you, because the POW package has excellent documentation that you can refer to after this video. So just sit back and try to synthesize what's going on in the next few minutes, knowing that you can always find the exact steps to follow in the docs. Okay, the first thing I'll do is open up the mix file, and I'll scroll down to the deps function, and I'll add the POW package as a new dependency. Then I'll save the file, and I'll fetch our new dependency by keying mix deps git. Now, I want to point something out before we move on. I'm going to run mix deps compile, then I'll run mix help, and I want to draw your attention to these mix tasks highlighted right here. All of these tasks were just added from the POW library that we just installed, and we'll be using a few of these throughout the video to help us get POW up and running. In fact, the very next thing we'll do is run the POW install task, so I'll key mix POW install and I'll press enter. Okay, so what just happened? Well, this migration directory was created, and this database migration file was created, which will create a users table. Then in the context area of the app, a users directory was created, and a user source file was created, which contains the schema definition for our users. Now, you see all this stuff down here? This is basically a description of the configuration we need to perform to get POW working in our new project. But before we follow these instructions, I want to show you something in a separate terminal window. So from within this project directory, I'm going to run the mix task Phoenix routes, just to show you the routes that exist before we do any POW configuration. Basically, there's only one route, the root route shown here. I just want you to make a mental note of this for the moment, and we'll come back to this terminal throughout the video as we configure POW, and we'll see what new routes get added from the POW package. Okay, so back to the configuration steps here that we need to complete. I'll go ahead and highlight and copy this config snippet, then I'll open up the config directory, and I'll open up the config file. Then down near the bottom of the file, I'll paste the config I just copied. So what's going on with this config? Well, basically, we're telling POW what module to use for users here, and what module to use for the ecto repo here. Now, I'll give you a quick heads up. We'll be coming back to this config file a few more times throughout the video as we add new auth-related features. Okay, back in the terminal, I'll highlight and copy this plug-related snippet, which we'll need to paste in the endpoint file between the session plug shown here and the router plug shown here. So I'll open up the endpoint file, which is in lib task app web, then I'll scroll to the bottom of the file so I can find the right place to paste the snippet we just copied, which should be right here between the session plug and the router. The last bit of config we need to do is in the router file. So first I'll copy this line right here, use POW Phoenix router, then I'll open up the router file, and I'll paste the snippet near the top of the file. Next, I'll copy the scope block, and I'll head back to the router, and I'll paste it just before the existing scope blocks. Okay, by adding this scope right here, which includes this call to POW routes, we've effectively added some new routes to our app. So let's go see what new routes have been added by heading back to the terminal, and I'll run mix Phoenix routes again, and as you can see, there are several new routes that our app can handle right here. These routes are for registering a new user, and these routes are for signing in and signing out. I'm going to head back over to the other terminal window, and I'll run the mix task ecto setup, which will both create our database, as we haven't done that yet, and it'll run our new user's migration that was automatically generated a few moments ago. Okay, I'll go ahead and start up the Phoenix server, then I'll open up the browser, and I'll navigate to localhost port 4000, and we see the default homepage that all new Phoenix projects include. Now, if we wanted to, we could navigate to this route right here, registration/new, which would show us a functioning registration page, but instead, here's what I want to do. I'll modify this page that we're looking at by getting rid of this Get Started link, and I'll add some conditional logic that will either show us a sign-in and a registration link when there is no signed-in user, or if a user is signed in, it'll show their email and a sign-out link. To make this change, I'll open up the templates and layout directories, then I'll open up the app.html.eex layout file. Next, I'll get rid of this line of code here with the Get Started link, and I'll key in the following embedded Elixir tag, and I'll say, if there's a logged in user, which you can check by calling a function in the POW plug module named current user, which takes the connection struct, and then I'll start a do block. Now, when this is true, I'll display an li tag, and I'll embed the current user's email. Then I'll add another li tag, and I'll embed a link using the link helper function. The text of the link will be sign out, and it'll point to this route here, which I can get by calling the routes helper function named POW session path, and I'll pass in the connection struct and the delete atom. And lastly, I'll say the method for this link should be delete, which effectively allows this link to simulate the HTTP delete method. Next, I'll say else, in other words, when there isn't a signed-in user, in which case I'll create another li tag, and I'll embed a link named register, which will point to this route, which I can generate by calling the route's helper function POW registration path, passing in the connection struct, and the new atom. Lastly, I'll add one more li tag, and I'll embed a link named signin, which links to this route, which we can generate by calling the routes function named POW session path, passing in the connection and a new atom. Then I'll go ahead and close out the do block by keying end. Okay, we should be able to try this out. So I'll pull up the browser again, and we see the register and sign in links right here. And if I click on the register link, we're taken to a page where we can register a new user. Cool. I'll go ahead and enter my email and password a couple of times, and I'll click register, and it worked. I'm now registered, and as you can see right here, I must be logged in because we see my email and a sign out link. If I click on the sign out link, you see that I'm logged out, and of course I can sign in successfully as well. Now that we're able to sign in and sign out, let's create something in the web app that we can lock down to only be accessible by logged in users. So to do this, I'll use a generator, the Phoenix HTML generator, to create a set of CRUD pages and the associated code. I'll key in tasks for the context module name to use, then task for the schema module name, and I'll say the database name should be tasks. Next, I'll say our new tasks table in schema should have a description field of type string and a completed field of type boolean. Okay, when I run this, we see a bunch of auto-generated source files here, and we see that we need to add this snippet to our router file, and we need to run our newly created database migration. Let's handle this bit of code here by opening up the router file. Then near the bottom of the router file, I'll create a new scope, which I'll pipe through the browser pipeline. Then on this line, we need to paste in the code snippet you see here. So I'll copy this, and I'll paste it into our router file. Now I'll go ahead and apply the migration by running the mix task ecto migrate. Let's go take another look at the routes in the app again. Okay, now we see all these new routes for our new task resource. Next, I'll start up the server, and I'll open up the browser, and I want you to notice that I'm not currently signed in. Now I'll navigate to /tasks, and we see an empty list of tasks, so I'll try to create a new task. And as you can see, it worked, but the problem is I really only want to allow signed-in users to create tasks. So let's fix this by adding some rudimentary route-based authorization or access control. Okay, so back in our router file, I'll create a new pipeline named protected, and I'll use a plug named POW plug require authenticated, and I'll pass along an error handler option that specifies the POW Phoenix plug error handler module. Okay, so what do we do with this new protected pipeline? Well, we'll just use it right here in this new scope I created a few moments ago. So instead of piping through just the browser pipeline, I'll also pipe through the new protected pipeline, and the way I'll handle this is by wrapping the browser atom in a list and adding the protected pipeline onto the end of the list. Okay, so what we just did here should limit access to the tasks resources to only signed-in users, but let's verify this. So I'll start up the server again, and I'll pull up the browser, and notice that I'm not signed in. Now I'll navigate to /tasks like I did earlier, but notice what happened this time. The page was redirected to the sign-in form because the page I was trying to open up can only be accessed by a signed-in user. All right, so I'll enter my credentials. And as you can see, I was redirected back to the tasks index page. And just for good measure, I'll create a new task. And as you can see, it worked. Now, there's a question that's probably nagging at many of you watching this video, which is that you're probably wondering about these registration and sign-in pages. And in particular, you might be wondering, where did they come from and how can you customize these pages if needed? Well, we didn't actually create any view or template files for these pages. Essentially, these pages are being generated at runtime by the POW library. Okay, but how would you go about customizing these pages? Adding your own labels, CSS, and so on. Well, to handle this, you just use a POW generator to create the view and template files, which you can then customize. Let me show you how this is done. So to create the view templates, I'll key in the mix task POW Phoenix Gen templates, and as you can see from the response, these two view files were created, and these three template files were created, which again, you can modify as needed. I'll make one small modification to one of these templates just to demonstrate what I told you, but first, I need to add this line right here to the POW config. So I'll copy this, then in the config file, I'll go ahead and paste it onto the end of the POW config. Next, I'll make one small cosmetic change to the registration page by opening up the template file in templates PAL registration named new.html.ex. Now I'll just change the h1 tag from register to create account, and I'll start up the server. Then I'll open up the browser and navigate to the registration page, and as you can see here, our change is visible. Okay, there's one big thing that's missing from our auth implementation. Can you think of what I'm referring to? How about handling password resets when a user forgets their password? Well, password resets isn't a feature that's automatically enabled, but it is a feature you can explicitly enable, so let's go do that. The password reset feature in PAL is in what's called an extension, and these are the extensions that are included with the PAL library. Now, the first thing you typically need to do to enable any of these extensions is to create a migration for the extension with the command PAL extension ecto-gen migrations. Then I'll add the extension option, followed by the extension we want to use, which in our case is PAL reset password. This particular extension doesn't actually modify the database, so as you can see from the response, no migration file was created, so technically we could have skipped running this command, but I wanted to show it to you because you'll need it for other extensions. Next, I'll pull up the config file, and I'll configure PAL to use the extension PAL reset password, and I'll add a controller callbacks key, which points to the module PAL extension Phoenix controller callbacks. Now we need to configure the user module by opening up the user file in the directory task app users directory. Next, I'll use the PAL extension ecto schema, and I'll pass along the extension as a list that includes the PAL reset password extension. Okay, now we have to add a change set function that takes the user or change set and pipes it to the PAL change set function, passing in the attributes. Then the resulting change set is piped into the PAL extension change set function, and we'll pass in the attributes to this function call as well. Now I'll open up the router file, and I'll use PAL extension Phoenix router, and I'll pass along the extensions we wish to use, which in this case is just the PAL reset password extension. Next, I'll scroll down to the first scope block that we added earlier in the video, and at the end of the scope block, I'll call the function PAL extension routes, which will add all the necessary routes for handling password resets. The next thing I'll do is generate views and templates for handling password resets, which can be done with the following PAL generator, PAL extension Phoenix gen templates, and I'll pass in the extension option, followed by the name of the extension, PAL reset password. And as you can see from the result, one view file was created and two templates. So what are the new routes we just added here on this line? Well, let's go take a look. Okay, my terminal is getting a bit messy because my font size is so large, but if I scroll up a bit, you can see these new password reset routes. Next, I'll open up the sign-in template, and I'll add a link to reset the password. And then I'll start up the server again. Then I'll head over to the sign-in page, and as you can see here, there's a forgot password link, which takes us to the reset password page, where we can enter an email and click submit. Actually, do you think this will work, or are we missing something? Well, let's try. Okay, we got an error, and as you can see from the description, the error seems to be related to not having email set up. In other words, there's no way for our server to email a password reset link. This isn't a big deal. We can fix this by adding a new file to the directory task app web, and I'll name the new file palmailer.ex. Then I'll define the task app web palmailer module, and in the module, I'll use the PAL Phoenix mailer module, and I'll require the logger, which we'll use in a moment here. Now there's two functions we need to implement in this module. First, we need to create a cast function, which takes a map with a bunch of fields you might want to use in the email that's getting sent, but in our case, I won't actually modify the contents of the mail message per se. I'll just return a map that has a to field that's set to the user's email, and I'll just pass along the default email subject, text, and HTML. The other function we need to create in this file is the process function, which is passed an email map, which is this map we returned here. Then in the body of this function, you simply send the email using a library such as Bamboo to your email service provider. Now for this video, I won't actually be sending the email. I'll just log the contents of the email, and we'll take a look at what gets logged in the terminal. Next, I'll use another PAL template generator by keying PAL extension Phoenix Mailer Gen Templates, and I'll provide the extension option and the name PAL Reset Password. So let me ask you this. What do you think this generator will create? Any ideas? Well, basically, this generator creates a mailer view module, as well as an HTML and text template files, which you can modify to customize the outbound emails. This snippet right here needs to get placed in the task app web file, so I'll copy it, Then I'll open the task app web file, and I'll scroll to the end of the file, and I'll paste in the snippet. Next, I'll add a bit of config for the mailer by adding a mailer backend key, which I'll set to the PAL mailer module we created just a few moments ago. Okay, let's see if the password reset functionality works now. So I'll start up the server. I'll click the Forgot Password link, then I'll enter my email, but before I press enter, I'll clear the terminal so we can easily see the email content that should get logged here. Then I'll submit the form, and this time we didn't get an error, which is a good sign. And if we peek at the terminal, we see the HTML representation of the outbound email, and right here we see the password reset link. I'll go ahead and copy this link, then in the browser I'll paste in the link, and as you can see, we're at a reset password page, so I'll go ahead and enter a new password twice, and I'll submit the form, and it seems to have worked, and I'll verify this by entering my email and my newly changed password, and it works. Cool. Okay, but what if you wanted to add other sign-in options, like sign in with Twitter or Facebook or GitHub? Can that be done with the PAL library? Well, yeah, it can be done rather easily with the related library, PAL Ascent. Let me show you how this is done. First, I'll open up the mix file, and I'll add a new dependency for the PAL Ascent library. Then I'll fetch the library by keying mix steps git. Next, I'll run the mix task PAL Ascent install, which will create a new migration file, and it'll create a new user identity schema. Now I'll pull up the user module, and I'll use PAL Ascent ecto schema. Then I'll open up the router file, and I'll use PAL Ascent Phoenix router. Next, I'll create a new pipeline, almost exactly like the browser pipeline you see here, except I'll remove the Protect from Forgery plug, as this is problematic for OAuth. I'll call the new pipeline Skip CSRF Protection, and I'll include all the plugs you just saw in the browser pipeline. Now I'll create a new scope block, and I'll pipe requests in this scope through our new Skip CSRF Protection pipeline. Then I'll add the PAL Ascent related routes by calling the following function. Okay, let's see what new routes this function call here added. All right, the code I just entered added these routes here, which we'll see in action in just a moment. Next, I'll run our new migration to create the user identities table. Now I'll run the new generator to create a new view and template file. So I'll run the mix task PAL Ascent Phoenix Gen templates, and as you can see, one view file is created and one template file. So you might be wondering, what is this template for? Well, when a new user registers by logging into a social connection like Twitter, Facebook, or GitHub, and when they're redirected back to our app, we'll want them to enter an associated email address, and this is the view and template file that collects the new user's email. You'll see it in action in just a few moments when we test this thing out. Okay, now we've got PAL Ascent set up, well, except for one thing. We need to configure the social providers we want to use. In other words, we need to configure the login options, such as login with Twitter, Facebook, GitHub, and so on. I'm just going to set up one provider, GitHub, but keep in mind the process is very similar for all the providers. So first, I'll navigate to this GitHub URL, which will let me register a new OAuth application. I'll give it a meaningful name, and in this case, I'll say the homepage URL is just localhost. And lastly, I'll add an authorization callback URL, which is localhost port 4000/auth/github/callback, which is this route we just looked at a moment ago. Now, after I register this new application, we see the client ID and the client secret, which we're going to use in our app's config file in just a moment here. So I'll open up our config file, and I'll add the new config for PAL Ascent, and I'll include the provider's key, which I'll set to a list. Then I'll include the GitHub key, which I'll also set to a list. Then I'll add the keyword client ID, which I'll set to a string. Then I'll copy the client ID from GitHub, and I'll paste it in as the value. Next, I'll add a client secret key, and I'll set it to a string. Then I'll copy the client secret from GitHub and paste it as the value. And lastly, I'll add a strategy key, and I'll set its value to Ascent Strategy GitHub. Now we need to add a link to the login and registration pages that allows users to log in with GitHub. So to handle this, I'll drill into the directories templates, PAL registration, and I'll open up the edit template. Then down at the bottom of the file, I'll use an embedded Elixir tag, and I'll use a comprehension to get every link from a call to PAL Ascent, Phoenix, view helpers, provider links, passing in the connection struct. Then in the do block, I'll create a span that includes the link. You'll see the link that this creates in just a moment here. Next, I'll add the same link to the new template, and I'll add the same link in the session new template. Okay, I'll start up the server, then in the browser, I'll click the register link, and if you look right here, you see the Sign In with GitHub link. Cool. If I click this link, I'm redirected to GitHub, where I'm shown an authorization prompt. I'll click the Authorize button, then I'm redirected to the OAuth registration page, where I can add an email for my new login credential. I'll enter a slightly different email address, since I've already created an account with my normal email, and as you can see up here, it worked. Cool. Now I'll go ahead and sign out, and that worked. And I'll try and sign in again, and that worked as well. Nice. Okay, so in just a matter of minutes, I was able to create a brand new Phoenix project, set up authentication, and I created some simple route-based authorization, and I added the ability to log in with GitHub. Now think about how long it would take you to roll your own system that did these things. Yeah, you probably shouldn't roll your own. You should just use POW and POW Ascent. So if you end up using these libraries, which is a pretty good option in my opinion, and if you like them, you should at a minimum reach out and thank the primary library author, Dan Schultzer, for all his hard work. I don't know how much time he's put into this project, but I'd guess many hundreds of hours, so please let him know you appreciate his work. And additionally, if you can, please consider sponsoring Dan's open source work, either personally or through your employer. I think open source authors are truly underappreciated, but we can change that if we can all give back just a little bit. Hey, if you like this video, please hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.